Hello, cooking enthusiasts. It has actually been a bit of a minute since I posted a new frozen dessert recipe. This recipe is, of course, based off of a recipe from my cookbook, Gelato Obsession, which is still available as a PDF for only $5. You can check the first link in the video description for that. Now, interestingly, I have a chapter about fruit flavors in my book, of course, but there is no apple recipe in that chapter. Toward the very end of the book, I have an apple pie flavor, which uses a reduced caramelized apple syrup, but for this recipe now, I wanted a fresh apple flavor. So this recipe is actually adapted from my orange gelato recipe because that one uses fresh orange juice and I am swapping in freshly made apple juice among a few other adjustments, of course. And obviously, I think using freshly made apple juice is really important. This recipe, I was able to use a custom mixture of apples that gave me the flavor I wanted. It is just around 60% Granny Smith apples for that really classic green apple flavor, and the rest is Honeycrisp apples for a bit more sweetness, a bit more complexity. If you did want to do something like this, I think some Granny Smith is good, but there's also interesting apple varieties that you could use entirely. You could go 100% Honeycrisp, Pink Lady, etc. For a flavor I am introducing later in the recipe, I wanted that green apple note, including the skin of the Granny Smith for both flavor and color. And the only tricky thing is that I have to estimate the sugar content. Obviously, you can get a hydrometer, refractometer, and actually take a measurement, but I didn't have any of those handy. I know that commercial store-bought apple juice is just around 10% sugar, so I estimated that this homemade juice was about 8.5%. And obviously, we are making this juice fresh, but the best way to keep it for later use is to freeze it. The first actual step in making this particular is to weigh and record the mass of the mixing bowl because all of our cooking process is going to happen inside that bowl, and the next day we need to add some additional ingredients. So on that second day, we want to be able to get an actual weight of our entire current mixture, which will let us scale the added ingredients. Then we also started by measuring the heavy cream in the bowl and adding our pre-measured powdered gelatin. Obviously, I edited this out, but we let that gelatin sit in the cold cream for 10 minutes before measuring and adding the milk. That is a very important step because I use gelatin in the vast majority of flavors that involve extra liquid, like the apple juice we are going to add. The rest of the process is pretty standard for all of my gelato recipes. We are cooking the mixture over a double boiler so that the temperature increases relatively gradually and gently. Again, I'm editing a lot of this out, but we are stirring frequently, but not constantly, and the dry ingredients were added once the mixture had reached around 40 Celsius. All of the ingredients will be linked in the video description, but the dry ingredients were, of course, sugar, dextrose, a little bit of dry milk powder, salt, and our usual spices. And this initial cooking phase ends once we after the cooking phase for any frozen dessert base, we need to rapidly cool it down to at least room temperature. So for this, we are using an ice bath, but we are also introducing the frozen apple juice. So off camera, we did measure the exact amount we needed for this particular recipe, and we made and froze this juice a few days before using it, but with proper freezer storage, you could do it easily weeks or months before you need to use it. And this definitely required a little bit of patience and careful stirring with this particular recipe because we add the frozen juice. The ice bag underneath was probably unnecessary. Once we reached room temperature, some of the ice was still frozen, so it was just about continuing to stir until everything melted. And it's also important to note that during the entire cooking and cooling process, the whisk has stayed inside the mixing bowl. We don't want to lose material by constantly removing and putting the whisk in and out of the mixture, which would eventually throw off the ratio of the dairy base to fruit juice. Once of the juice was melted, we simply place plastic wrap right up against the surface of the liquid and refrigerate overnight, which is especially important for bases using gelatin. The next day, we are removing the plastic wrap and measuring the mass of the entire bowl. We can subtract the known quantity of the mixing bowl. In a hypothetical perfect universe, there would be 942 grams of the current gelato base, but there is definitely less than that. So we can use our actual current total to calculate the quantity of ingredients adding on day 2. We would have hypothetically added 50 total grams of fermented tomatoes, but because it's a little less, we ended up adding just over 40 grams. Obviously, this is a very unique ingredient to be putting inside of a frozen dessert. We made these last summer. It was a super simple fermentation with a little bit of herbs and a brine with a 4% equilibrium salt quantity. After over 5 months of fermenting, they have a really pronounced sourness, which is, of course, a different sourness from apples. And they do have a slight savory green olive note, but I mainly want the sourness and the slight green astringency to complement that green apple flavor. Obviously, most people are not going to have fermented green tomatoes on hand, so you could easily take other apples, pears, Asian pears, and simply ferment those with 4% salt. I think any kind of starting material like that, and even ginger or other aromatic you want to add, would still create a really nice fermented product to add complexity. But getting back to gelato, we are blending everything thoroughly, both to break down and incorporate the fermented tomatoes and to break down the gelatin structure. That blending has raised the temperature of the base, so I always pre-chill the mixture in the freezer before the actual churning. At this point, I also remembered to add the apple brandy, which is pretty much just there for texture, so you could use almost any distilled spirit. And I like to bring the mixture just around 0 or +1 degrees Celsius before churning to increase the churning rate. And that is pretty much it for this recipe. As you can see, the texture came out pretty perfect. We probably could have blended it a little smoother, but the final result looks and tasted totally smooth. You still got the occasional tiny piece of the fermented tomato. Flavor-wise, ultimately, it's really pleasant. I think I estimated the juice sugar level very well, and the sweetness is balanced. The more sweet notes of the apple definitely get a little bit lost. In future attempts, I might just use a little more overall apple juice. And again, I could have used an actual fermented orchard fruit of some type to also enhance the apple flavor. But I do still enjoy the fermented tomato brought. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. Again, you can check out my cookbook, Gelato Obsession, available online for $5. Otherwise, thank you for watching.